The Sex Pistols lineup of Sid Vicious, Johnny Rotten, Paul Cook, and Steve Jones imploded right after their gig at the Winterland Ballroom on January 14, 1978, less than a year after he joined 11 months ago, back in March. According to Malcolm McLaren, it was his intent to destroy the band before it became too popular. He replaced the original bassist, Glenn Matlock, for allegedly liking the Beatles, when in reality, it was because Glenn was tired of being around McLaren and Rotten, who developed this animosity towards him, which became unbearable. With their only musician gone, Sid Vicious was brought in because he had the look of an ideal punk rocker. McLaren would later call him the gimmick of the band. To his credit, Vicious had this natural charisma about him, and he had the potential makings of a future frontman. Sidney, however, had two very big problems. One was heroin, and the other one was Nancy Spurgen. Nancy was a former New York Dolls groupie and later became a Heartbreakers one. She followed the Heartbreakers to England when they were part of the ill-fated Anarchy tour, which was led by the Sex Pistols. Malcolm McLaren was an old associate of the members of the Heartbreakers, Johnny Thunders and Jerry Nolan, due to his brief time in 1975 managing and being the haberdasher of the New York Dolls, and he invited them to play on the tour. Nancy tagged along, looking to nab Johnny Rotten, because she wanted a Sex Pistol, but he pawned her off on his buddy Sid, and it became love at first sight. After the dissolving of the Sex Pistols, Lighton stayed in California for a bit, trying to find a ticket so he could fly back home. After Cook and Jones left with Malcolm McLaren, who flew out to Rio de Janeiro to do a poetry reading with fugitive Ronnie Biggs, Lighton refused to go over moral principles. Vicious took off from San Francisco to go back home to England, but was taken off the flight when it landed in New York City at the JFK airport due to a near-fatal overdose of alcohol, methadone, and Valium. Roberta Bailey, a photographer and employee at the CBGB's, befriended Sidney, and he confided into her that the doctors told him, "I can't drink. I can't. Like the doctor said, if I drank anything even remotely like the way I've been drinking for the past however long, I have 6 months at the absolute outside to live. I can't be straight. My basic nature is going to kill me in 6 months." A few months later in April, Sid and Nancy were back together, filming segments for the film The Great Rock and Roll Swindle in Paris, France. Nancy wasn't invited to pal around with the Sex Pistols during their tour of America. She waited in London until Vicious was released from the hospital and sent home. The two were doing their favorite hobbies while in France, holed up in their hotel room, drinking and riding the White Horse. The director of the film, Julian Temple, and Malcolm McLaren had a tough time trying to get him sober enough to film his segments. Vicious held up production one day and attacked McLaren and forced him to sign a document that would release him from Glitterbest Limited and from the reins of his management. After that, Sid and Nancy made their move to return to the Big Apple, where they envisioned that Sidney would become a rock and roll pop star. In order to fund a trip to New York City, Sid and Nancy held a benefit show at the Electric Ballroom. The band that backed Sid was led by bassist Glenn Matlock, drummer Rat Scabies, and guitarist Steve New. They called themselves the Vicious White Kids. The money they made from the show, along with some donations from the crowd, gave the couple enough money to buy a plane ticket and relocate to the Big Apple. The couple resided at the Hotel Chelsea, an infamous place where many writers, musicians, actors, and artists called home. They stayed there until the death of Nancy, but that is another story for another time. Nancy acted as his manager as the strung-out duo tried to make a go of it as his career as a solo artist. Nancy got Sid a residency at Max's Kansas City, an infamous music venue which was known for the Velvet Underground's last stand with Lou Reed during the summer of 1970, and one of the homes of the New York punk rock scene during the early 70s. Nancy felt that Sid belonged there. To back Sid, who was no longer playing bass, was the band The Idols, which was led by Steve Dorr, an associate of the Sex Pistols, and the rhythm section of the New York Dolls, Killer Kane and Jerry Nolan. There were also several guitarists who would rotate in and out. Most notably was Mick Jones of The Clash, who was also a friend of Sid Vicious. Sid would play at Max's throughout the month of September. It was during these shows that Sid Vicious heard in the crude, bootleggish live recordings demonstrate how charismatic he was, holding his own during these chaotic and raucous shows. The bizarre banter he had with the crowd, who often heckled him, along with film and video footage of him playing with the Sex Pistols, and his buddy Johnny Rotten, who felt threatened by his onstage antics, felt he was constantly trying to upstage him. With a decent manager and solid record label behind him, he could have been a real star, similar to that of Billy Idol, who pretty much had the career Sid could and should have had if he had his head on straight. Sid and Nancy's drug use grew so bad that they wouldn't leave their hotel room at the Chelsea. His residency at Max's Kansas City ended on September 30th, and his solo career was over. 3 weeks later, Nancy's life would end in their hotel bathroom on October 11th, 1978, under mysterious circumstances, with Sid being the main suspect. He was released on bail arranged by Malcolm McLaren and his label, Virgin Records. To raise money for Sid's legal fees, McLaren wanted the Sex Pistols, Cook and Jones, along with Glenn Matlock, and they were going to record a Christmas album with Sid on vocals. And he co-designed a shirt with his partner Vivian Westwood to raise further funds. Even though he was on bail, Sid would get in trouble again on December 5th when he attacked the brother of Patti Smith, Todd Smith, in a club after flirting with his girlfriend. He would spend over a month on Rikers Island for violating his bail when he was arrested for being a suspect in the death of Nancy Spurgen and spent time in the jail's detox program. On January 18, 1979, a judge released him from Rikers and warned him to stay away from clubs and continue his program. Unfortunately, after being clean for so long, Sid would pass away from drug overdose on February 2nd, 1979, at the age of 21. Despite his death, Sid Vicious would become a pop culture icon and would what many would consider to be the face of punk rock. After his passing, Malcolm McLaren and his record label, Virgin Records, would exploit his death not only for the upcoming mockumentary, The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, but they would slowly release 3 songs as singles: My Way, Come On Everybody, and Something Else, covers of classic pop songs he recorded for the movie, and lo-fi recordings of Sid on stage were put on the album Sid Sings, probably an effort on Virgin's part to recoup the legal fees they spent on Vicious's lawyers, and Malcolm being Malcolm and trying to squeeze as much as he could out of Sid Vicious's legacy. One famous rocker who was highly influenced by Sid Vicious was Billy Idol. Like Sid, Billy was also an uber fan of the Sex Pistols and was part of the entourage called the Bromley Contingent. Billy later became a performer in his own right with the punk band Generation X and briefly playing in the group Chelsea. He changed his look, bleaching his hair and spiking it out, wearing jeans, a leather motorcycle jacket, and engineered boots, looking like a blonde Sid Vicious. After his band Generation X imploded, he moved to New York City in 1981 and suffered similar issues like Sid with drugs and alcohol, and almost ending up in the same way if it wasn't for the success of Dancing With Myself, the cover of Moni Moni, and Hot in the City, along with the support of his record label, Chrysalis. Billy Idol had the career that Sid Vicious could have had looking back. He had the look, style, and charisma of a rock star. They both had a natural presence on stage, and in an alternate universe, we could have Sid Vicious having a 50-year career in pop music and Billy Idol suffering a similar fate when his band, Generation X, fallen apart, and him dying in New York City of a drug overdose after failing to have a successful career as a solo artist.